Hi, I'm Dr. Daniela Bruckman, an Associate Professor of Biology at Mesa College. In this video, we're going to continue exploring statistics with an introduction to a commonly used statistical test called the t-test. Now for this video, you will need a version of Microsoft Excel in order to run the test. And that's what I'm going to be using to show you how to complete this particular stat. Okay, so first off, let's explore a little bit about what t-tests are and how to know when to use one. So the t-test is a commonly used statistical inference that scientists may use when they're comparing data that has an independent variable which is categorical. And that usually is going to be associated with different experimental treatments. So for example, if you are comparing hot and cold temperatures, or if you are comparing red and yellow flowers. So this is what I mean by categorical. A better description of different types of data can be found in one of our previous statistics videos. So if that's a little confusing to you, I would go back and watch that video first. Now, if in fact your data is going to have an independent variable that is categorical, we use a t-test when we have two sets of data that we want to compare. And these two sets of data should be independent sets of data, meaning that we compared them independently of each other. They're not connected. They're not the same subject, right? So in this kind of t-test, this is known as the unpaired t-test when these are independent groups of data. And this is the one that we're going to be focusing on. There is another type of t-test known as a paired t-test, which is oftentimes used to analyze two sets of data that are connected in some way. For example, if you're measuring a before and after on the same subject, whether that be an organism, a person, whatever. And then finally, we want to make sure that when we're using a t-test, that our categorical data has numeric dependent variables, meaning that we would be able to calculate the average value of our two groups if we had to. Okay, so this is when you're going to use a t-test. Again, in summary, two sets of data that you are capable of taking the average value of. Okay, so now for this next part, I'm going to show you actually how to use a t-test on Microsoft Excel. So I'm going to switch over to that, and we're going to start working on a hypothetical set of data that I have created beforehand here. Now remember, for our t-test, we have two different sets of data that we want to compare in order to determine whether these two sets of data are different from each other, right? That's sort of the whole point of analyzing experiments. Are my two treatments different? So for this hypothetical data, I created a spreadsheet of some values associated with habitat restoration. So let's imagine that we run an experiment and we want to know whether biodiversity of pollinators, insect pollinators, is different in habitats that have been restored, meaning they have been planted with native plants and restored to a more native state or natural state, and compare that restored habitat to a control group, meaning habitat that has not been restored. So in our restored treatment, we can see that we have 10 values here. So I could highlight these restored values, and that would be one of our treatments. So this would be our independent variable. And then our dependent variable, remember, has to do with biodiversity. So in this case, I'm using species richness as our dependent variable, which just really means the number of species, in this case pollinators, that were observed in each of our restored sample habitats. Now remember, we are comparing our restored habitats to a control treatment. So similarly, we have 10 control samples, and each of these control samples, which have not been restored, are going to have species richness values associated with them. So ultimately, we want to test this hypothesis, right? That restored habitats have species richness values that are distinct from control habitats. Now, we're using Microsoft Excel here, and I'm using the latest version of Excel for Mac. And this may vary a little bit depending on which type of Excel or which version of Excel you're using. Before we even get started, it's important to be able to have the right data analysis add-ins. And so if you want to check to see if you have these add-ins, you're going to find your tools option, and you're going to scroll down to where it says Excel add-ins and click on that. In order to run the t-test, we want to make sure that this analysis tool pack add-in is clicked in. If it's not, make sure to click it in, and if it is, then you are all set to go, so just click on OK. If you don't have this version of Excel, one way to find out where the add-ins are would be to go to Help and search in add-ins. And that would take you hopefully to that add-ins option. Okay, now that we have our add-in, we can go to this data tool option here. And if the add-in is selected or if it's turned on, we're going to see this button right here that says data analysis. So if you have that data analysis button, you're all set to go, and you can absolutely run a t-test on your data. Okay, let's go ahead and run this t-test then. The first thing we need to do once we have our add-in in place is to put our data into a format that the program is going to recognize. So that just means that we want to make sure that our data is sorted, that all of the restored values are together and all of the control values are together. So for example, if your data is kind of sporadic and you have restored values mixed in with your control values, just make sure you go to this sort option and go to this sort option and just make sure that your data is sorted appropriately by choosing the column that you want to sort by. In this case, it would be treatment. And since it's already sorted, I don't need to do anything. Okay, cancel. All right, so now what we want to do is we're going to go over to this data analysis button. We're going to click on it, and right away it's going to show us a bunch of different types of data analysis tests that we can run. If you scroll down near the bottom, we can see that there are a few options for t-tests. Now remember at the beginning I said that paired t-tests are when we're comparing a before and after on the same subject. Usually we're not using that one. So the one that we want to go for is t-test to sample assuming equal variances. That's the one that we'd most likely be using. And so we'll click OK on that. Now, the next most important thing we want to do is give the program the proper variable ranges. So it's basically asking us, what groups of numbers do you want me to compare? So here it has it highlighted variable 1 range. We just want to make sure for that one that we're going to include our first set of data. And in this case, it's going to be our restored values, right? Because we're comparing restored with a control group. For the second one, we're going to highlight that, and we want to highlight the values that are the control group. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is to make sure that we are only highlighting the numbers and we are not including these letter variables, the labels, right? So we don't want to highlight the restored letters or the control letters, just those numbers, okay? And this is really all we have to do. So once we've given the program the two sets of numbers that we want it to compare, we will simply click OK, and this is going to render us a output or an output sheet. And this is where we're going to find some really important variables. Now, the first thing that we might want to look at is the mean of both of our groups. So I believe variable 1 here was our restored data. So the restored habitats had an average species richness of 9.1. So I'm just going to highlight that so you can see it better. And then our control habitats had an average or a mean species richness of 5.8. So right off the bat there, you can see that there is, this difference in average values for our two treatments. Now, the most important number we want to look for, of course, when we are analyzing data, is our p-value. And notice that we have two options for p-values here. Most of the time, we're going to be looking at this two-tail value. So this number is our magic number. Okay, this is telling us that our p-value is 0.005. Now that number, if you recall from learning about more fundamental statistical ideas, in general, statistically significant differences are usually going to occur when our p-value is less than 0.05. So here we have an order of magnitude less than that. Here we have 0.005. Therefore, our two groups, if we go back to our data here, we can conclude that our two groups are in fact statistically significant, or statistically significantly different. And what that means, of course, is that that analysis supports the hypothesis that restored and control habitats have significantly different species richness. And that's it. So that's how to run a t-test. In our next video, we'll be looking at how to run another test called the ANOVA. Thanks.